Something very humiliating for Abram. Because he at this point had fallen. He had fallen from living according to his faith in God. He had resorted to acting according to his own flawed human thinking, which were fed by his fears. And he resorted to the sin of lying and deceit. And when found out, he was rebuked by an ungodly pagan king. So a very humiliating time for Abram. And kicked out of the country, and he's headed back to Canaan. And so that was last week. As we come to chapter 13 this morning, we see Abram and Sarah, along with Lot and his family and all their possessions, heading back for Canaan. And in this chapter, there arises a situation of strife between Abram and Lot. So before we get into the lessons that are here, let's go through the story so we all know what's going on. Verse 1 starts out by telling us that Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev. That's the area of southern Israel, kind of southwest of the Dead Sea. Most of your Bibles, or maps in the back of your Bibles, if you look at some of those, you can see that area we're talking about, just up from Egypt into the Negev. With his wife and all that he had, and Lot and all that belonged to them, and it was a huge, huge caravan. Abram was rich by this time. Remember from last week, he had received gifts and done well while he was in Egypt. Pharaoh treated him very well because of Sarah. Apparently Lot had done fairly well too, so both had extremely large herds and flocks. There's a big caravan that headed out of Egypt to the Negev. So they got to the Negev, and then it says they moved on there from place to place, like the nomads that they were, finding pasture for their flocks, until they got to Bethel, where Abram had come when he first came to the Promised Land. They came to that same place where he had pitched his tent before, where he had built an altar before and called upon the name of the Lord before. Same place. And you saw that a couple weeks ago. Now, as we saw last week, Abram, the man of faith, he's known for his faith, but we saw last week he had not been walking by faith. Abram at this point is still young in his faith. He's still learning to walk by faith. And we saw last week that he fell. He resorted to living according to his own flawed thinking, which was governed by his fears, and it led him into a lot of trouble. He needed to come back to living and acting by faith. His faith in the God who had called him to come to this country. He needed to come back to that. He needed to confess his sin and restore that fellowship between him and God, and get his thinking back in line with his faith in God. I think that's what's going on here at this altar when Abram got back to Bethel, the place he'd first come to, got back to that altar where he'd first built when he first came to Canaan, and he got back there and called upon the name of the Lord. The journey back to Bethel and the altar he had built there previously, I think, in a sense, is symbolic of a spiritual journey back to living by faith. His faith in God for Abraham. So going on, as we've already seen, both Abraham and Lot had large herds and flocks of livestock, and up until now they've been living together, pasturing their livestock together. But because of their great gains in the last while, and probably while they were in Egypt, greatly, it was becoming an impossibility. In that vicinity between Bethel and Ai, there just wasn't enough pasture to go around. And so strife began. It started with the herdsmen. Abram and Lot, of course, both would have had herdsmen in charge of making sure that their flocks got grass and water. And since there wasn't enough to go around, these herdsmen began fighting with each other over whose flocks should get the piece of grass or the spring of water or whatever. And then verse 7 tells us that the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. So it wasn't just Abraham and Lot struggling for pasture for their flocks. There were others there too. Did any of these Canaanites and Perizzites observe the quarrel between Lot's people and Abraham's people? I don't know, it doesn't say. I'm speculating here, but did they? these people who are living by faith in the one true God, they're quarreling. And these people who worship pagan gods, did they see this? Were they watching this quarrel? It's interesting. I don't know if that's true or not, but speculating. But it does bring up an interesting point. When we as Christians start fighting, the unsaved world around us is watching. And it affects our witness for Jesus Christ. So that's just something to think about. So Abraham took it upon himself to do something about this strife. He came to Lot and said, in verses 8 and 9, he says, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we're brothers. Is not the whole land before you? Please separate from me. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. Or to the right, then I'll go to the left. Isn't that something? The uncle coming to the nephew in an almost condescending manner and proposing a solution. When Abraham, the uncle, he had the right to tell Lot what to do. But Abraham saw that the only possible solution was them separating. And he gave Lot first choice. And that tells us something interesting about handling strife. We'll come back to it. So Lot looked up and he started looking around and he saw that lower Jordan Valley, that area just north of the Dead Sea, along the Jordan River. It was lush and it was green. Lots of good pasture for his flocks, lots of water. The rest of Canaan was a little more semi-desert, of like southern Canaan at any rate. But that area was well watered and irrigated. It kind of reminded him of that good land of Egypt along the Nile River, where they had likely increased their riches greatly. So Lot wanted that good piece of land. So he chose for himself the Jordan Valley. And he moved into it, settled there in the region of Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 12 says he moved his tents as far as Sodom. Then verse 13 goes on to tell us that Sodom was a very wicked city. And we're going to see that as we go on in Genesis. We're going to see God deal with Sodom and Gomorrah for their great wickedness. But anyway, that's where he pitched his tent, right close to that city of Sodom. They had no morals there. Other passages bear this out. They're people that lived according to the depths of human depravity, especially it seems in the area of sexual morals. But that's where Lot settled. So keep that in mind. Abram settled in the higher lands of Canaan. And after they separated, the Lord spoke to Abram. Verses 14 through 17. And the Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk through the land, through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Isn't that great? Abram had given Lot first choice. But God told Abram, after Lot left, God told Abram, look around you. All that land that you see, God promised him, was yours. All the land that you see, Abram, I'm going to give to you and your descendants. And he even told Abram, go travel the whole country, top to bottom, left to right. It's all his. And the chapter closes out with Abram settling a little further south down in the Hebron area. So that's the story of this chapter. A chapter that talks about strife, and it has some good lessons for us in the area of handling strife. So let's look at it and see what it has to teach to us. So we need to know how to handle situations of strife in a godly way, and we can learn how to do this by studying these teachings that come out of this passage. So number one, solving strife requires being close to God. Solving strife requires being close to God. As I've already mentioned, and as we saw so clearly last week, Abraham had been out of touch with God when he was in Egypt. Abraham had seen a potential problem when they were going down to Egypt, but instead of seeking the face of God in it, he dreamed up a plan to combat the problem totally of the flesh, totally of his own thinking, and a plan that was deceitful and thus sinful. He was not walking by faith. He was letting his fears govern him, and he was walking by the sight of his flawed human nature, of the flesh. It led him into grief. But the first 4 verses here in chapter 13 are almost like a pilgrimage back to God. Notice that the writer, as he talks in the first 4 verses of chapter 13, he doesn't just describe geographical locations as he traces Abram's journey back to Bethel in Canaan. He mentions things that have spiritual significance. He went to Bethel, the place where his tent had been at the beginning. The place he had settled in earlier, where he had built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord, and the Lord appeared to him there and gave him that great promise that this was a land for his descendants. That place, that's the place he went to. The writer makes sure we understand that. Notice also in verse 4, he went back to the place of the altar, where he had made there formerly. That altar where he had called upon the name of the Lord and God had appeared to him. So this is more than just a trip back to Canaan. It was a pilgrimage back to God. It was a renewal of his lapsed obedience. Commentator W.H. Griffith says, he returns to where he had been at the commencement. He came back to the true surrender and simple worship of his earliest days in Canaan. So we see Abram coming back to full obedience to God, restoring fellowship with God, once again getting back to walking by faith and not by the flesh. And I believe that this spiritual recommitment gave him the spiritual strength to walk by faith when the strife arose between him and Lot. So the lesson for us, friends, is that in order to handle disagreements, the disagreements and the resulting strife that may come into our lives in a godly way, we must be right with God. We must be right with the Lord. If you're not walking in step with God, there's no way you can do things God's way. It doesn't matter what the strife is, whether it's property rights, as it was here, or something as simple as a personality clash, or strife when rises when someone wrongs you or hurts you in some way, or when you have a disagreement with someone and you both have very strong convictions about it. Neither is willing to back down or give. Strife results. In order to deal with it God's way, you must be walking close to God. You must be walking by faith in God and not by the flawed view of the flesh. And you may well think, well, of course I'm walking with God. It's the other jerk who's living in sin and not walking with God. That's why they did what they did. Well, maybe the other party did sin against you. But if you are holding grudges in your heart and bitterness in your soul, you're just as much out of step with God as he is or she is. And you won't deal with strife in the right way. Friend, if there's strife in your life and you want it solved, you must first be right with God. That's the first thing I want us to see here. No grudges, no bitterness, remorse if you've sinned against someone. Living by faith, walking close to God in full fellowship with him, living by faith and not by the sight of human flesh. When you're in that place, then you can deal with strife in a way that's pleasing to God. Secondly, going for what seems best is not always the best. Going for what seems best is not always the best. Here I want to focus on Lot and his actions. When we read that read that Abram was very good to Lot here. Abram offered a solution which was to separate. They're going to have to separate company. They can't keep traveling around together. And that was obvious. That was the solution. And he gave Lot the first pick of where he wanted to settle. So how did Lot, the nephew, respond to this offer from his uncle? Verses 10 to 13. Lot lifted up his eyes and he saw the valley of the Jordan. It was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. It was like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go towards Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. And you can read on. So Lot, I take it that they're kind of standing up on a hill, looking over, surveying the whole country, and Abram's saying to Lot, you pick a spot, go where you want to go, and I'll go the other way. And so Lot, he's looking around, and he chose what, in his judgment, was the most highly favored portion of that land. He saw the Jordan Valley. It looked so green and so lush. His livestock would do well down there. His riches would greatly increase. Besides, there's some beautiful and well-developed cities down there which would be very convenient to live close to. That was the place he wanted. So he chose the Jordan Valley. But, as we're going to see as we go on in Genesis, and as commentator George Henderson says, one commentary read, it was the first step to a path that led to irretrievable disaster for Lot. You see, Lot chose the material best without considering the spiritual best. He focused only on the physical and the material without considering the spiritual. He put himself and he put his family in the vicinity of Sodom and Gomorrah, which verse 13 tells us was exceedingly wicked and sinners against the Lord. And as we're going to see in the ensuing chapters, this proved to be disastrous for him and his family. So friend, in every decision of life, we need to consider spiritual consequences of our decision, not just the physical consequences. What seems best physically and materially may not always be the best spiritually for you and your family. And may I suggest that the spiritual should take priority over the physical and the material. If it doesn't, it may bring disaster in a very short time. We need most of all to look to God in making these decisions, something that Lot never did. God knew about the soon destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. He would have never led Lot there if Lot had been seeking the face of God. And also this is true in the area of handling strife. There may be a temptation in solving disagreements with others and in resolving strife. It may be a temptation to be selfish in it, as Lot was, to take advantage of the other person, especially if they're being nice to you, to take advantage of them, to insist on getting what you see as the advantage. And you know, that's easy to do. Especially if the other person comes to you and initiates the solving of the strife, ready to do some giving to resolve the issue. And it's possible, perhaps tempting, to take advantage of that. Take what you can get, whether it's materially or emotionally or whatever, and somehow better yourself, so you think, in the relationship or in the community or perhaps in your church or whatever. But all the while, you're not considering the spiritual consequences of your actions. Friends, remember, going for what seems the best may not always be the best. You need to seek your direction from God after you are sure that you're in close fellowship with Him. And consider, above other things, consider the spiritual side of life and the spiritual consequences of your actions or reactions for both you and your family. Walk by faith, not by sight. What seems best may be just your fleshly walking by sight, what that's seeing. Walk by faith. And when it comes to resolving strife with others, don't be selfish in it, as Lot was. Don't try to milk all you can from the situation at the expense of other person or other people. That's not of God. That isn't considering your own spiritual condition and the consequences. That's the path of sin. So what seems best may not always be the best. And then thirdly and finally, unselfishness is rewarded with God's blessing. This is just the other side of that same coin. Unselfishness is rewarded with God's blessing. We want to focus on Abram and his handling of this situation of strife here, because what he did and how he handled it and conducted himself, that's exemplary. That's our example here. Abram handled the situation with a giving attitude and a generous spirit. Altogether unselfish. He saw that the only possible solution for him and Lot was to separate. He saw that. He let Lot have first choice as to where he wanted to move his herds and settle down to. He would go in the opposite direction. When, as the uncle and as the elder of this whole unit and the chief of this whole caravan traveling around, Abram had every right to take first choice and tell Lot where to go. But he didn't. He gave Lot first choice. Abraham could do that. Abraham could be generous and he could be unselfish because he was walking by faith. He let Lot take first choice and then let God choose for him. By faith that God would take care of him. That's heavenly wisdom. And so this strife and separation and his response of faith, instead of damaging Abraham's spiritual condition, it brought out full view for everyone his growing spiritual principles and actually strengthened his life of faith. Thus it worked for good and yielded a harvest of blessing. You see, Abraham lost nothing by being unselfish. He didn't lose a thing. He had already, earlier in his life, he had already renounced everything when he left his homeland and went to the land God would show him. And subsequently, God had promised him the whole land of Canaan for his descendants. Abraham could afford to act this way. He knew what God had promised, and he believed what God promised. He had put his faith in what God promised. And now he's back to walking by faith. He had no need to judge, as Lot did, by the sight of his eyes. He was walking by his faith in God. God had already promised him the whole land. And that's true, friend, for any child of God. The true child of God can afford to be unselfish. We can afford to be generous. Simply because we're a child of God. Acting God's way will bring God's blessing. God has promised to supply all our needs. God has promised to provide for us, always. We can afford to be generous and unselfish. When you walk by faith, you can afford to do that. So Abraham met the situation with generosity and unselfishness and was rewarded. Verses 14 through 17. Your God came to him and said, "Now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are. Northward, southward, eastward, westward, all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants of the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth. I'll give it to you." So Abraham, verse 18, moved his tent and came to dwell by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. He heard God's promise. Again, one word added this time, that word forever. I don't think in the previous promises God had used that word forever, but here he does. This land would be his descendants forever. Not that this promise wouldn't have been his anyway, but just hearing that promise again was rewarded in itself, and a blessing to Abraham in and of itself, that after he had been unselfish, God brought that promise. No, actually, Abraham, it's all yours. The whole thing, everything you see, it's all yours. Friends, we need to settle strife in God's way. I'd like to mention just a couple of things here in application. Number one, we need to deal with strife. When strife comes, we need to deal with it, and promptly, like Abraham did. Don't let it ride. Don't let it ride. The more you let it ride, the more you put it off, the worse the strife will get. The more bitter you will become, the more hurts there will be that will have to be healed. Deal with it. The first opportunity. Don't let it ride any longer than you have to. That's something I've learned many times the hard way. Especially in marriage. The importance of dealing with things promptly. I've learned the sooner you do, the less there is to apologize for, the less hurt there is, and the easier it is to make things right. Secondly, don't be demanding of your rights. Abraham wasn't. He had every right to tell Lot where to go. He was the uncle. He was the head of the tribe. He was the leader of the clan that was traveling together. In dealing with strife, it never helps to be demanding of your rights. That only builds barriers higher and stronger. It's beautiful to see two people resolving strife by being generous and giving, both willing to give up their rights. That's when things can get solved in a godly manner. And when someone has hurt you and sinned against you, it's easy to demand your rights and say, well, he or she has to come and apologize if it's going to be resolved. I didn't do anything wrong. They're the one that did wrong. They need to come to me. And, well, friends, that's not God's way. That isn't biblical. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 18? If your brother sins, in the context, you can tell he's saying, if your brother sins against you, go reprove him in private. Go talk to him. Deal with it. It's biblical to take the initiative to solve strife. If there's strife in your life with someone else, you need to go to that person and privately deal with it and resolve it. As you do it God's way, the blessings of God will be yours. You will be rewarded. You'll be at peace with your brother and sister. You'll be at peace with God. Your faith will have grown. You'll have taken another step in learning to walk by faith. And that's what this is about. So therefore we see this morning some good lessons about resolving strife God's way. We see, number one, solving strife requires being close to God. Before you can make any headway, you need to be walking in step with God. You need to be living and acting according to your faith in God and not according to the flesh. Secondly, going for what's best is not always the best. Make sure the spiritual consequences get first priority. Thirdly, unselfishness is rewarded with God's blessing. Don't be demanding of your rights. I'm not sure where you're at this morning. If there's any strife you're facing or not, I have no idea. But that's the passage here that we're in this morning. These principles always apply. This is not by any means an exhaustive study on all the details of dealing with strife. Obviously not. These are basic underlying principles of dealing with strife that you base everything else on. Is there some strife going on that needs to be dealt with? Like I said, I don't know. But first, make sure you're in fellowship with God. If not, restore that. Then deal with it God's way. Make sure you deal with it. Don't put it off. Deal with it, but deal with it God's way. Let's just take a moment of silence like we do every Sunday morning and just, each of us in our own hearts, come to God and open ourselves up and let God tell you what He wants to say to you this morning, and listen.